Hi everyone, my name is Adrienne Groff and I will be doing my presentation on observations as a form of data collection. So to start, basically a description of observations. It's pretty self-explanatory because I think we do it all the time as teachers. Basically, you are just observing your classroom or your classroom in a different setting or certain social areas as well. And the goal of it is just to kind of help to answer the question that you're ultimately looking for. So while you're doing your observations, you should be recording things so that you can refer back to them at a later time, because obviously you're not going to remember everything that you see. And what I did learn with Mertler was that videotapes is a perfectly acceptable form of observation, because it does allow you to record in real time, but then look at it at a different time where your thought process might be a little bit different and you might be able to view it in a different light than in the moment. But they did say he did mention there are some restrictions with that. Obviously, when it comes to a camera, you can't move it unless you're standing there with it. So although the purpose might be to have it be a standalone object, it's also going to be tricky because it's not going to move on its own. So it involves you having to play with it throughout the observation time. Also, some kids are a little camera shy and might act differently when a camera is present. So that's something that you'll want to be aware of if you were to use any type of video recording to use for your observations. Overall, this form of data collection is considered qualitative. And as you can see here, I thought it was helpful to include a chart that kind of shows the different aspects of quantitative versus qualitative to really get a feel for what might be considered qualitative, what would be quantitative. But qualitative overall, both Mills and Mertler both mentioned that it's kind of the narrative of its own data. So whatever you record in your notes section is kind of dictating how the conclusion to your question and exactly what data you're pulling and how you're looking at it. Pros and cons of both of these, so basically their strengths and weaknesses. Mertler really talked about how teachers are doing the observations, and that's obviously a pro. If you're going to be doing the action research project, you obviously want to be the one that can be observing. And I'll talk later about exactly what kind of role you can take as an observationist, because there are different roles that you can be. You also get actual eyes on the situation versus perception from the test group's point of view. So obviously, I know as a primary teacher, I wouldn't necessarily give my kids a form to fill out of their perception of something, but I might ask them a question about, well, how did that make you feel? And their perception can sometimes be misconstrued, or sometimes they don't understand the question well enough to be able to answer it. So this is a chance for me to get more reliable data because I'm watching it versus hearing it from the student's point of view. Especially with students, we all know that sometimes they can misconstrue and kind of tweak what the reality of the situation actually was. Also, like I mentioned, you can use devices. Obviously, there are some cons to that, but it's a great alternative to gathering data that really doesn't take you away from teaching. Because I know sometimes that can be a concern when you're doing an observation. It's hard to do it knowing that you still have to be teaching and there's other kids that need you at that moment while you're observing that test group for that moment in time. As far as its weaknesses and cons, the biggest is the fact that students do act differently when they know that you're observing them. So when you're just sitting right there with a pencil and paper, sometimes they can feel that and they can sense it. And whether they know you're observing them or not, just that whole visual of what you're doing and how you're not interacting with them, they know that you're observing them. So obviously behaviors can be a little bit different. So they did recommend that if you are doing this, and I'll talk later more about it, they don't recommend using observations for a behavioral issue, just because it can kind of strew that data. Another thing that can be a con is that it does make for a longer process. Just because you want kids to not have that change in behavior and that change in interaction with each other. So it would take a longer process to do observations because you can't just rely on one or two observations. You're going to have to rely on observations over an extended period of time. And that's ultimately going to give you the best data results because it's going to take away that factor of the students just doing it because they know you're watching you. And they'll be used to it over time and they'll just start acting as normal then. Another thing they mentioned was if you do have more than one person on your team, sometimes your data can be a little screwed because you see it in two different ways. So you're obviously looking at the same thing and you could have watched the same exact issue occur, but you might have understood it differently in how each kid solved it. Even though they solved it one way and you both watched them do it, how you understand that and how you take it in and what you think about it moving forward can be a little bit differently, so it can kind of cause some issues there. And then obviously with the recording aspect, it can be a daunting task to record. And like I said, it's going to connect with that first con, which is that students are going to probably act a little bit different the first time, or at least the first few times in which they see that until they're kind of used to it and don't see it as anything. The same goes, I think, for when you look at observation schools. I know I went to Shippensburg University for my undergrad, and they actually had a school on campus that had one of those like windows. And obviously, I think students at first, especially when they're first in that school for the first time, they are a little bit shy of the fact that they can see people watching them. And the teachers say that. Like, obviously, the primary kids have more of an issue with being observed and they kind of tense up or they do things differently than what they might because someone is watching them. Whereas once they get older, they're used to people coming in and seeing them, so it's really nothing different for them. So they act almost as normal at that point. Just some personal thoughts about observation. I really like that it's a way to observe, but you have to, a way to collect data, but you almost do need to kind of look at it from a new lens. It's easy for us as teachers to observe and easily look at it and think, oh, I want to fix that in my next lesson, versus my real purpose for observing these students. So it's good that you need to kind of take yourself out of teacher mode and put yourself into like researcher mode so that you're looking at it from like a fresh lens as far as what you're looking to get out of it, and you're not looking at the other aspect, which is the teaching aspect of how you want to make sure that whatever error they made in that math class is not something that they're going to continue to make. And the biggest thing Mills said, and Mertler too, was that you just need to make sure that observation is the best method for your question. Not every question is going to fit well with an observation as the data collection method. So you really have to think about your question and determine whether observation is the best method or not. And just be aware of what kind of a participant you want to be. Mills really goes into the 3 different types that I've listed: the active, the privileged active, or passive. So an active observer is just a normal teacher just engaging in the outcomes of their teaching. So it's just you observing your classroom in general. When you go to be a privileged active observer, that's when he kind of describes you as somebody who is interacting with your class in a different time. So if you were to observe during a specials time, during a lunch period, in order to see some of those interactions with other students and kind of that social climate, that would be when you're kind of that privileged active. You kind of work as a teacher's aide, like you kind of are just there in the classroom, but you're not really serving much of a purpose other than just being observant of that. They do say there are times that this would provide opportunity for teachers to work as like a teacher's aide in other classrooms where you kind of are moving in and out, but I do think that's hard to do when you're trying to be an observer. I think it's almost best to make sure that you're an observer in one instance and a teacher in another, to really keep both of those mindsets in a different place. And then obviously there's the passive observer. It's when you completely no longer take any responsibilities on as a teacher. So as an active observer, you are still in teacher mode and an observer mode. In a passive one, you're strictly observer. You're not interacting with the students in a teacher way. You are just basically sitting there and taking notes on them and focusing really on that data collection. Finally, when it comes to validity, reliability, and ethical values, I did reach out and use an additional resource. On my last slide here, you'll see the exact one, and I will include it in my post then as well so that everyone has a copy of it, because I thought it was really good. Overall, reliability, they talked about how you should be ensuring that you're routinely observing. That's going to be the best way to get the most reliable aspect or reliable data collection. Is that you're doing it at the same time with the same students if it's a small group, or at least within the same class period on a consistent basis. When you throw it off, obviously, I know for my kids working in urban ed, they're really triggered by routines and changing of them. So to ensure that I'm getting reliable data, I want to keep it on a routine, because that's where they are better acting as if themselves. Whereas if you throw them off the routine, that can kind of cause behaviors that you're not really looking to see, and won't necessarily, and it'll kind of steer your data, like I've mentioned before. Another thing is obviously the validity. They really highlighted that you should really look at completing this in the long-term factor, because, like I mentioned before, kids will react differently when they know you're observing them. So in order to kind of make it a norm for them so that you're not getting those different behaviors and that different action, you want them to kind of be used to it. So it needs to be a long-term process versus short-term. You're not going to get the most valid data by just observing a couple times. So obviously, this might be something that for the action research project we're doing, observations might not be the best if you're only going to be doing it for 2 weeks or so. Because you might be wanting to look at something more of a long-term process for that. I mean, obviously, if you're continuing this on past this course, then it would be a great data collection method to use. But if you're just using it for this course and your data collection time is only about 2 to 3 weeks, then you need to be considering maybe other options, because your data is not going to be the most valid, is kind of what they said. And this is where they mentioned that they highly recommend not using observations for behavioral observation purposes, just solely because behaviors can change, and observing them, you're going to run into that true data aspect a lot more. And then obviously when it comes to ethical values, you just have to be aware of privacy concerns, making sure that you're not providing names with your notes. I would keep it very simple. When you're taking notes, just have a way to connect it to, if it's a small group, one of the 5 kids that are in that group, so that you kind of have an idea, or whether you can, or even just making note that it's a male or female making that action or whatever you're observing there. You just want to make sure that you're keeping names out of it at all times, and just obviously ensuring that there's informed consent. Otherwise, obviously within a school, observation is something that's common and something that I think parents and principals know that you're doing at a constant basis. So just making sure that you have that informed consent if you're looking to make it into a project that is going to be needing board approval and whatnot. So then finally, I added the additional resource that I had found, which was the methods for establishing validity and reliability in observation protocols. And like I said, I'll make sure to include that article in my post. Thank you, guys.